So this talk wanted to give to share some of the things that we've been doing with customers to help them optimize their value delivery through organizations. And one of the reasons that I wanted to give this talk was to share these techniques because anyone can do them. Yes, you benefit from having experience. Yes, in some ways it's easier to do as an external consultant, but the individual techniques on their own are freestanding, and I believe that you will get value from them. So the stages involved in this process. First of all, I need to make sure that we are finding out the reality on the ground. That's the most primary thing. We want this to be data-driven. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different techniques that we use there. Primarily value stream mapping. You can get some really quick returns on that. We often do a lot of interviewing with members of the organization, as many different disciplines as we possibly can. And also group facilitation is something that we found works really well, both for finding out information about the organization and then sowing the seeds of change. The whole purpose of finding out that information is to build a causal model. This is something that was introduced to us by Simon Copsey, who's attending the meetup this month. And it's a systems thinking tool called a current reality tree. And you can kind of think of it like the exercise of 5 whys, but on steroids. So we find out as much data as we can about the reality of an organization and build it into a model that then can be used for discussion and can be tested and validated. Once we've done that, we actually need to then, present the information back in a digestible format. And a key part of that is presenting a menu of different options, a menu of different things and remedies that can be done to make things better. Just knowing what it is that could be better is not enough. And so we actually need to make some improvements and drive change forwards. All of this, though, is underpinned by a couple of key principles. The first is scientific thinking. We really need to be data-driven, and that's the reason for spending so much time looking into the reality of an organization. We don't want to be led by dogma. We don't want to be going off on random paths. We have to have evidence for what we believe in. The other principle there is building trust through kindness. Now, this is really key. If you want to find out the reality of somebody's job and what their pain points are and what they're struggling with and what's difficult, they need to trust you. And in order to trust you, you need to demonstrate kindness, vulnerability, integrity, all of those sorts of things. So in order to get the information that you need to make things better, they have to trust you. Similarly, we want this to not just be a fact-gathering exercise. We want to be able to affect change in an organization as well. And so we need to kind of get people on board with that kindness. And if they don't trust you, they're not going to trust the things that you say and the things that you recommend. So always acting with empathy and kindness is absolutely key there. The two combine in the principle of having strong opinions loosely held. If I believe a thing, I should believe it because I've got evidence for it. I should be data-driven, and I should be able to explain why I believe a thing is true. If it turns out that that's not the case and the data no longer stack up, then if I can drop that opinion and go, okay, I was wrong about that, so let's move to something that does work, then you'll start building more trust with people, and they will see that you're not applying some dogma, your favorite set of practices, and trying to force people into doing just what you think is cool. So the two of those are key to the whole process and run through it. So let's have a look at the inquiry stage and the different techniques that we've used there. You've probably heard the parable of a bunch of blind folks who are touching an elephant and trying to work out what it is. And because none of them have the big picture view, they all come away with different ideas of what exactly is going on and what exactly the thing they're touching is. A development process is very much like that. The way that value flows through an organization is very much like that. Often we've got people cut up into little silos and nobody's responsible for the overall system. It's almost emergent. Everybody's focused on their own little area. So we need to try and zoom out and get as much of that picture as we can. And the primary tool for doing that is value stream mapping. So this is where we draw all the steps that an idea goes through in order to get into production. So maybe we're just talking to developers and we can only see our little part of the world. But ideally, you want to get as many people all the way through the value stream involved as you can. So if you can get the CEO involved, great. If you can get the product people involved and the program management people involved, great. If it's just the developers and QA and the DevOps people and the deployment folks, then that's still good too. I'm sure you'll still learn things from it. So we identify all of the stages where work is done. And then we need to work out how long steps take. So how long it takes to do each one of those stages. And we get an overview of the whole process. So we get to see, for as much as we can, given the people that we've involved, what exactly is going on when we want to get work done. Now, value stream mapping, there are entire books about. That you can go really deep into this. You don't need to get some good insight. That would be the key thing that I want to make sure that people take away from this. So how do we go about doing this? Well, I mentioned that we need to identify the steps and how long they take. So once we've identified what those tasks are on the path to production, we need to identify the duration of work steps. And if you ask people, so like, how long does it take to implement a feature? Then quite rightly, you're going to get the answer back of, well, it depends. So one of the tips that I would give and the techniques that we've used is to ask people to give a probability distribution. So you can hopefully make out there in the diagram in the background that we've got duration running along the x-axis and probability along the y-axis. And you can see there that there are a few tasks that take 1 day. Most of them come in around 5 days, but there's still a sizable chunk that take about 20 days to do. By using this kind of way of expressing certainty over how long things take, you get a good upper bound, lower bound, and a median case. So as well as identifying how long things take to do, we also need to identify how long things are spent in waiting in queues. So maybe it takes 6 hours to implement a feature and 2 hours to do a code review. So that's a total of 8 hours working time. But what happens if it takes 3 days for anyone to get around to doing that code review? Then we've got a lot of lag in the system. So we want to identify the wait times as part of this exercise. This is also a really good opportunity to identify how often things go back. Like, how often do we have to return to Go and not collect £200 or 200 euros or $200? I don't know how well Monopoly travels. But this will give us an idea of churn and waste and rework in the system. Now, we identify the work times and the wait times so that we can then go on to calculate flow efficiency. So this is a measure of how effective your organization is and how much time is actually wasted, how long inventory is spent sat on the floor. And I'll explain that metaphor a bit more in a moment. So it's defined as the amount of time spent working versus the total amount of time. So the amount of time spent working and waiting, and then multiplied by 100 to give you a percentage. So in our example earlier, we talked about the fact that maybe it's 6 hours to implement a feature and 2 hours to do a code review. That would give us 8 hours of work time. But then if it's that pull request is waiting for 3 days to be reviewed, then we have a total work time of 32 hours. I can do mental arithmetic just about, almost better than my primary school age children. And that gives us a flow efficiency of 25%. So what that means is, if you think of your code like a car moving through the assembly line of a factory, 75% of the time that car is in the factory, it's sat doing nothing, collecting dust and taking up space. Now, you might think about, well, code doesn't take up any space, right? We have infinite inventory. Code that is sat waiting is a risk. It becomes stale. People lose context on it. So if it needs changing, it's going to cost more time to get back up to speed on. It increases the risk of things like merge conflicts and having to rebase and all of those sort of things. Not to mention the impact this will have on your lead time to production. So this is when we go into organizations, this is one of the metrics that we encourage them to start tracking. I talked about being data-driven and using scientific thinking as one of the key principles. One of the challenges that we have when we go into organizations is that they're not tracking any of this stuff. They know how busy all of their staff are and how utilized they are, but they don't know how long it takes them to get stuff into production. They don't know how much time they spend waiting. So tracking these kind of metrics will give you a North Star to aim for, to improve upon. So with value stream mapping, it gives us an idea of the flow efficiency and the lead time to production. Yes, you can do this exhaustively, and you can dig into Jira and to GitHub and find all the metrics. If you've got the time and the resources to do that, great. You can do this in a retro. You could get your team together and do this as part of a meeting. If you're a leader, a team lead, a manager, a CTO, then you can pull all the people together that you need to do this. But it gives us, even doing it quickly on a whiteboard, gives us a rough indication of what the state of the world is. Often when we do this with folks, it's the first time they've ever seen the whole thing. I can think of a customer that we worked with who didn't realize that every single code change had to be merged at least 5 times to get to production. No one had ever realized that, and the chief engineering officer in the room was like, that's bonkers. We need to do something about that. By drawing it up, we also make the pain points obvious because they're explicit, they're on the wall, and everyone can see them. So that helps orient people around to start thinking about the things that can be improved. So even if you just do this with the people immediately around you in a meeting room for an hour and a half, I'm sure that you will get value from it. Pun fully intended. One of the other techniques that we use is interviewing people. And this is really when we're doing a consultancy engagement where we get the bulk of the data and the real insights. So we'll talk to people from around the organization to try and find out what's really going on in their jobs and not just what leadership think is happening. Maybe that's governance, compliance, development, security, testing, configuration management, you name it, we'll try and speak to them and ask them as many questions as we have time for. Normally, we talk to them for about half an hour to 2 hours, depending on how many people are in the room. And we take a huge amount of anonymized notes. So I have twice now on different engagements run a ballpoint pen dry by the number of notes that we take. And all of that is about gathering this data that will feed into the causal model. So the kind of questions that we end up asking. First off, the fact finders. These are the ones that I'm sure you can imagine that we would ask and establish the base facts. What does your team do? What does success look like? How do you know when you've done a good job? And how does work get into your team? This is often a good way of validating the value stream map of, are there other routes for work to sneak into your team that aren't being accounted for and are invisible and are taking up time that nobody's tracking? Once we've got those kind of things established, then we can start looking into what are the problems here? What gets in your way? What is stopping you from being successful? And what gets on your nerves? What makes work not enjoyable? Typically here, this is where you'll find out about systems, decisions, architecture, people that have proven problematic. And this is the time where we really dig into all of those and try and explore it as thoroughly as possible. As we talk to different people, then you'll get recurring themes, and then that gives you an indication that, actually, okay, this is a thing that's impacting lots of different folks. And then finally, we want to start getting people thinking about improvements for the future, not just because they have great insight, because they're the people on the ground, but also so that when improvements are suggested later, they're already kind of on board with that idea that things have to change. So total pie in the sky stuff. If you had a magic wand, what one thing would you fix? Often folks, if you ask them what would they fix, they go, oh, we can't do anything about it. It's impossible. So encourage people to get out of that mindset and go, like, forget all the current constraints. If you could do anything, what would you do? If you were the boss, what would you improve? Again, people on the ground often have insight that leadership don't have, not through any negligence on leadership's part, but just because detail gets lost in transmission. So with all of that, that's how we do it as a consultancy going into an organization. As individual contributors and as people working in organizations, you don't have to do that as a formal interview. If you're an individual contributor, like, keep notes, keep a record of what comes up in retros, archive your retros, ideally. Talk to people over coffee. Take them to lunch. I don't know if you remember this, but at some distant point in the past, we used to go to these public houses after work and drink pints of liquid that made you feel a bit funny. You could do that. If you're a leader, if you're a development manager, if you're a CTO, maybe organize a series of one-to-ones to dig into these questions. It doesn't have to be a big consultancy exercise. You can find all of this stuff out informally. So we get lots of insight from as many people as we can on the reality of the situation. And it's also cathartic to be asked how things are going and what the problems are and how things can be improved. One of our customers said, this is like organizational therapy. Can you come along every month? And it was the first time in ages that anyone had actually really asked these people, like, how is it going? So again, with this process, if you did just this bit on its own, you would get benefits from it. More insight, better, higher morale. The last one of the techniques that we use that I'm going to talk about today is group facilitation. And if the interviews are about really detailed, long contact periods with a small number of people, then this is about opening it up to as many people as possible and trying to get things as quickly as we can whilst we get everyone in one place. So this is the kind of thing that you can do at internal tech conferences or, town hall meetings. You can do this online. This is totally doable on Zoom using breakout rooms and things like that. We want to find out information. And again, this is one of the 3 steps. This is the one that kind of really gets people thinking about improvements most of all. And it has to be fun. Like, it needs to be engaging. Otherwise, people aren't going to be honest. They're not going to be forthcoming with their information, and they're not going to be switched on to the kind of suggestions that will come later down the line. So what do these sessions look like? One of the techniques that we've used is using liberating structures, and one of the liberating structures, 1, 2, 4, all. There's a book which unfortunately I've left too far that way, so I can't reach down and show it to you on the camera. But there's a book full of liberating structures, which are ways of holding meetings that give everyone a voice, rather than just the loudest idiot with a mustache talking over the top of everybody. So 1, 2, 4, all involves posing people a question. They're then invited to think on their own as an individual for 1 minute and maybe write notes on an index card. After that, people merge into groups of 2 and talk for 2 minutes about the ideas that they have on their cards. After that, they merge into groups of 4 and talk for 4 minutes. And then we get everybody back together, go around each group and share the most important ideas, the ones they're most excited about, with everybody in the room. So that's the format, and it allows people to talk with maybe people that they don't normally speak with, and it gives everyone a voice. What about the questions that we ask? So these come from a framework called TRIZ, which is a Russian acronym for the theory of creative problem solving. And the first question we ask is quite a silly one to get people loosened up. What would be, if you could design the perfect organization for delivering absolutely no value, like the most rubbish development organization you possibly could, what would it look like and what would you do? And so people are invited to think about that on their own for 1 minute, go into pairs, talk about it for 2 minutes, into 4s, talk for 4 minutes, and then everybody gets back together. Obviously, it's a silly question, so people have a bit of fun, and there's lots of laughing and joking and things like that. We then repeat the process, asking a different question, and ask people to mix up. So speak to, don't just stay in your groups, change pairs, work with different folks. And the next question is, what do we do here that's a bit like that? Surely there must be some things we're doing that look a bit like that really ridiculous, over-the-top, silly organization that can't get anything done. And this is the point where you start getting nervous laughter out of people. And folks, if they've been having fun and they've been enjoying the previous section, then they should start feeling empowered to say the unsayable. They're invited to think on their own for 1 minute, in twos for 2 minutes, fours for 4 minutes, and then background the group. Often there'll be a series of questions, but one of the ones to use towards the end is, what could you do tomorrow without any extra authority, without any more responsibility? What could you do tomorrow that would make one of these things a bit better? Doesn't have to fix everything, but what could you do tomorrow on your own to make things a little bit better? So with this, there are some added benefits that maybe aren't obvious. By getting people together, whether that's on Zoom or whether it's in person, you humanize problems. If you can get the DBAs together with the developers and the QAs and the compliance and the governance and the security folks, when they're talking about the challenges that they face, it's very hard to refute that when there's a human telling you. Maybe these issues haven't been communicated face-to-face before, and it builds empathy within the organization. We also start sowing the seeds of improvement. Everybody has been exposed to the problems of everybody else. Everybody's heard about these issues and heard from people like what frustration it causes. So they're already aware of the issues, but they've also been consulted on what the problems consulted on what they think the solutions might be. So when later down the line, there are some suggestions for improvement, they'll already be thinking along those lines and hopefully on board. Now, if you're an individual contributor, this is kind of hard to organize, right? But you can make suggestions to leadership, do this at internal tech conferences, retros, those sorts of things. Anywhere where you can get groups of people together, then it will be a thing of value. And even if you don't end up acting on any of the things that come out of this, you will have made improvements because you're inviting people to be autonomous and make their own improvements, and you will have built that empathy and shared the frustrations that people see. So that's the inquiry phase done, and I'm likely to go over time. I'm looking at my clock. That's the inquiry phase done. We've found out as much information as we possibly can. The whole purpose of that is to get data into our causal model. And our causal model is a current reality tree. So this is a tool from systems thinking that is built from that prior research. If it's not evidenced, it doesn't go into the model. There's no room for opinion or dogma in here. It's just stuff we've observed. Otherwise, it can't be trusted. And it maps out cause and effect. Like I said before, kind of like the 5 whys on steroids. So they can be quite hard to get to understand. They're quite visually confusing, but the concepts are quite simple. So let's have a look at an example. This is a current reality tree that my colleague Jess and I wrote when throughout the course of a 1.5 hour lunchtime meeting with a potential customer. And you'll see that there are different boxes here with arrows pointing to them, and they're different colors. So with this customer, they complained to us about having low release cadence. They couldn't get changes out as regularly as they would like. And this is an undesirable effect. So the yellow boxes here are undesirable effects, things that people know are wrong and that are causing pain. That's caused by an intermediate cause. So that has an arrow pointing to the thing that it causes. And in this case, it was that engineers couldn't figure out whether they'd done the right thing. It took too long to know whether their change was good or not. There'll be multiple of these intermediate causes chained up. in this organization, it took them a long time to figure out whether their changes were good because they had to run loads of integration tests in their CI pipelines. Why did they have loads of integration tests? Because they didn't have very many unit tests. And this is where it gets interesting. They didn't have very many unit tests, in part because their code was hard to test. But in blue here, we have a root cause. This is something that doesn't have any arrows feeding into it unless it's a feedback loop. And often the root causes are behavioral or cultural issues or beliefs that haven't gone challenged. So in this particular organization, the engineers didn't think that TDD was a good idea. You know, that's something that hipsters do, and it doesn't really work. It so happens that the founding architect was from Google and came with a lot of interesting opinions. But because the engineers didn't believe in TDD and this culture had been spread in the early days of the organization, that meant that the code was hard to test. And because the code was hard to test, they didn't write any unit tests because, you know, it was too hard. But because they didn't believe in TDD, the code was hard to test. And because the code was hard to test, it was hard for them to believe that TDD could possibly be a valid way of working. So here we've got a feedback loop. And these are the things that become apparent when you start mapping them out in this graphical diagrammatic format. Feedback loops are the things that will either keep an organization in a holding pattern or cause a runaway vicious cycle. And those are the things that, if you identify some of those are the things that really need fixing. Otherwise, the organization is not going to improve. So building these current reality trees, it's quite simple. Like, there's only 3 things in it. To be honest, one of the most time-consuming things is laying it out nicely. And I know I have differences of opinions with some of my colleagues and ex-colleagues about the best way of doing that. Really, the secret sauce in this is just really thinking very hard about what you believe to be true. Like, does this really cause that? And thinking about that deeply. The current reality tree was not designed as a one-off intervention. It was designed to be a living document. So you don't need to be a consultant coming in and doing this as a one-off exercise. You can build this week on week, day on day, as you observe things and as you uncover them. The really powerful thing about it is that it is a model. If somebody comes along and looks at it and disagrees with some of the boxes that you've got there, you can take them out. Go, okay, cool, right? If maybe that's an assumption on my part, that box isn't true. How do you explain this cause? How do you explain this effect? And then you can reason about it and you can change it and you can try different things out. There's a whole kind of branch of science, causal calculus, that looks at this in a really scientifically rigorous way. You totally don't need to go to those extremes, but having a model allows it to be discussed and made explicit. It's showing you're working. Instead of writing an email going, we need to fix the CI servers because, you know, they're always crashing, you can show how you worked out that conclusion. And that, well, the CI servers are crashing because we've got too many integration tests, which is because of this, which is because of that. So the model is the absolute linchpin of this whole process. And I would encourage you to give it a go building some of those as you uncover more and more of what's going on in your organization. We then need to present things back. Because we're a consultancy, you know, nobody lets us get away without spraying some ink on some mashed up tree. So we have to write a report. Might be a bit of a formality if you're doing this inside an organization. But the current reality tree is the source of truth here. The current reality tree is the source of truth. And anytime you try writing it up in one-dimensional linear text, it's going to be compromised. And actually, it's really hard to try and synthesize the findings from the reality tree into text, because text has a beginning and an end, and there's only one direction through it. The reality of the situation is multidimensional, and things are interrelated, and there are feedback loops and all sorts. So be aware that anytime you try writing this stuff up, it's going to be compromised, and getting people to understand the diagram is really the path to true understanding. One of the things we do in this report is to produce a catalog of remedies for every single issue that we see in that diagram. And I'll come back to this point later about why it needs to be for every single box. But this is the point where you start, using your experience to figure out, okay, what could we do about that particular issue? What can we do about that issue? Maybe there are multiple solutions. And I expect that you probably wouldn't want to do all of them at once. But this is a good place to catalog all of those for further action. We also write a future reality narrative. Some folks talk about creating future reality trees. I personally find that is too much assumption, and you can imagine all sorts of future realities. But writing a narrative that's based around some of the remedies that you've identified helps people imagine what that might be like. So, for instance, if we pair program and we commit to trunk, and we sign all our commits with GPG keys to keep compliance happy, that kind of thing, where you're combining several of these to give an idea of what a day in the life for people in your organization will be like. If we detect that there's a really big mismatch in perception between folks on the ground and leadership, then we'll include an appendix of anonymized quotes to show the strength of feeling that people have. I think one of my favorite quotes, not for good reasons, is when somebody said, "If I caught someone committing to master, I would punch them." And that kind of gave us the ammunition to go to leadership and go, you do realize this is quite an ingrained culture, which was a surprise to leaders. And then we need to show people the tree. I've obfuscated these by having them in particularly low resolution. But if you've got an A1 printer, print out the diagram as big as you can, stick it on a wall, get people to go through it, do it on Miro and share it online. Walking people through the diagram will help. One of the things I didn't talk about in the diagrams that you can see here is where we've highlighted certain areas to communicate themes of the tree. And that can be really helpful in terms of communicating the broad strokes of what's going on. So we found out as much information as we can. We've built this model that's rigorous, can be tested, can be challenged. We've then gone and identified what could be done to make things better. Now we actually need to go and do it. So with these improvements, it has to come from within. As an external consultancy, we can help people. If you're doing this in your own organization, obviously it's got to come from within, but people need to be engaged and on board. This cannot be imposed from the outside. It just flat out doesn't work. We come back to one of our principles of scientific thinking. Any improvements that you identify and you want to make should be run as hypothesis-led experiments. For example, if we pair program and we commit to trunk, we think our flow efficiency will improve by 10%. This is key for two reasons: making sure that people don't end up doing the wrong thing and making changes that are damaging, and also reducing resistance. There's a big difference between somebody coming in, CTO I'm friends with, who came and went, right, on Monday, we're all doing pair programming and commit to trunk, and all this pull request stuff is nonsense, we're going to forget it. There's a big difference between that and somebody saying, we think that pair programming is a better way of developing software. So this team over here is going to try it out for a month, and if it makes our metrics better, we'll stick with it. You can imagine that one has much more resistance than the other. So we get to reality check our ideas and improve buy-in. I owe Simon credit for this. I mentioned that when choosing those remedies, we don't necessarily want to go with every single remedy that we've identified. And there are different levels of improvements and solutions and remedies that we can pick. So in this really quite simple current reality tree, which is nearly a true story, because in fact, Dermot was trying to stop me toe walking for many months, and unfortunately never succeeded. So my gait definitely is a bit strange. But in this current reality tree, we can see an undesirable effect of when I go running, my knee hurts. So one way to address that is, okay, take some paracetamol, take some ibuprofen. But that's not really going to be a long-term solution. It's quick, it's cheap, it's immediate, but it's not going to make the thing go away. Maybe my knee hurts because my running style doesn't match my trainers. So I could spend a bit more money and have something that would last a bit longer, but it's still not addressing the underlying cause of the problem. So really, there's a behavioral problem here. And there's something that will take a long time to change, but will make all of the other problems go away. And that's changing the running style. So if you think about this in the context of an organization, it's not appropriate it's for the leaders to decide how much strategic risk and effort they're willing to invest. Maybe they recognize that the behavioral cultural changes that take a long time are what really needs doing, but they don't have the resource for that, or they don't want to tackle that yet. And so by presenting a remedy for each one of these boxes on the tree, then you can give people the power and the information, the context to say, okay, this thing here, we're just going to make a quick fix, and we're going to start thinking about the long-term solution at the bottom of the tree to make all of these problems go away. So that was the improvement section. So we found out all of our information by value stream mapping. As a quick, fast feedback way, you can dive into more detail if you really want to. We've talked about getting information from individuals by speaking to them. Talk to them over coffee, over lunch, in the pub, in one-to-ones. Make notes. If you're going to get quotes, anonymize them. The group facilitation, using things like liberating structures and TRIZ, the 1-2-4 rule liberating structure, gets people's insight into what's going wrong, get them primed for thinking of how they can make improvements. Feed all of that into a current reality tree, a causal model that shows your thinking and why you believe what you believe. So then it can be tested, challenged, and argued and debated about. Then we can present it back, identify a whole load of remedies that people can then choose to run as hypothesis-led experiments in order to make sure that they're doing the right thing, they're not making anything worse, and that they're lowering resistance to those improvements. All the while underpinned by being rigorously data-driven and thinking scientifically and building trust through empathy and kindness. Now, it would be great to tell you about all the snazzy metrics of things that we've improved in customers by doing this and how this can work. The problem that I mentioned earlier is that a lot of our customers don't have metrics in the first place, so they don't know how bad things are getting. I can very quickly tell you about one customer. In fact, it was the customer with the example current reality tree where we did that as a initial kind of first meeting. With our help, they managed to reduce the amount of time between releases by 62%. So they were going from releasing every 8 months, I think, down to 3. Is that right? Maths isn't my strong point. We also had a customer where there was some really strange architectural decisions and a lot of time and money being wasted. And everyone was aware of this, but the architectural decisions were made by a founder of the startup, and they were seen as unquestionable. By going through and building the current reality tree and showing the arguments of why things were happening and why money was being wasted and what the root cause was, that empowered them to challenge those decisions that were made a long time ago. And that architect was given a slightly different role and a new problem to solve, and the rest of the development organization set about changing things. Finally, another customer that we worked with came to us with morale issues. Developers were thinking about quitting. Some of them were quitting. It was taking them far too long to get things through a CI. And they thought this was a CI server problem. We dug into the problem, and actually it was much more to do with their individualistic way of working, their mono repos, their pull requests. There were all sorts of things going on. Halfway through that engagement, the company got bought by a massive global media company, and they wanted a new version of their product released within a year. They were already at crisis point. By exposing some of the misunderstandings between leadership and people on the ground, we gave them a route forwards and made it clear that they need to do things like ditch their mono repo and change their pull requesting strategy. And I'm glad to say that as of the summer, they launched this product against all expectation. They thought that what they had wasn't maintainable, so adding another product on top was a massive win for them. 10 years ago, Tesla were busy building the best electric car that they could. They wanted to build the best electric car. Fast forward 10 years, they've already achieved that. They're now focused on building the best factory that builds the best electric car. So they went from building the machine to building the machine that builds the machine. In our development organizations, if we really want to improve the delivery of value and get people closer towards continuous delivery nirvana, there need to be people focusing on that higher order concern of building the human machine that builds the software machine. And hopefully these tools and techniques, you can take away, try one of them, try all of them, any single part of that, I'm sure that if you give a go, you will get value from. And you'll be pleased to know that that's it from me.